You are watching the death of the most powerful empire in human history. For a century, oil was king, but a new report from the IEA proves that the collapse isn't coming in 50 years, it's happening right now. As you watch this, electric vehicles are wiping out 6 million barrels of oil demand every single day. That is the equivalent of deleting an entire OPEC country from the map. The old king is being starved to death. But here is the terrifying catch. We are trading our addiction to oil for a new, even more dangerous addiction. Every single one of those cars needs lithium, and right now, the world is walking straight into a supply trap that nobody is talking about, except for one specific discovery that changes the entire game. The oil age is over. The lithium war has just begun. Here is who wins. Tonight we begin with a journey back in time, to a place that looks very shiny on the surface, but is actually a little bit grim underneath. I want you to go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and just get comfortable. We're going to be talking about the year 1880 in America. Now, usually when people talk about the late 19th century, they call it the Victorian era because, well, Queen Victoria was sitting on the throne in England, looking stern and wearing black for 40 years straight. But over here in the States, we call it the Gilded Age. And that's a name that Mark Twain came up with because he was cynical like that. He didn't call it the Golden Age, mind you. He called it the Gilded Age. And the difference is pretty important. Gold is solid. It's valuable all the way through. Gilded just means you took something cheap, like a piece of rusty iron or a rotting piece of wood, and you painted a very thin layer of gold leaf over the top so it looked expensive. And that is basically the thesis statement for living in 1880. It was a time of incredible wealth, massive mansions, and people lighting cigars with $100 bills, while just down the street, everything was covered in soot, horse manure, and a general sense of impending medical doom. So let's just float back to that time. Let's drift into a world where indoor plumbing was a luxury, doctors didn't wash their hands, and the most important thing in your life was whether or not Mrs. Astor invited you to a ball. Let's start with the sensory experience of 1880. If you stepped out of a time machine in New York City or Chicago, the first thing that would hit you, before you even saw the ladies in their bustles or the gentlemen in their top hats, would be the smell. We tend to romanticize the past as this sepia-toned, elegant place, but the reality was pungently different. The main mode of transportation was the horse. And horses, bless them, are biological engines. They eat, they move, and they leave things behind. In New York City alone in 1880, there were roughly 150,000 horses working on the streets every single day. And based on some very boring calculations that someone actually took the time to do, those horses were depositing about 2.5 million pounds of manure onto the streets every single day. There was no street sweeper machine coming by with spinning brushes to clean it up. There were just guys with shovels who were frankly overwhelmed. So if it rained, the streets turned into a toxic sludge. If it was dry and windy, that dried manure turned into dust that coated the buildings, your clothes, and the inside of your lungs. It was, quite literally, in the air. So when you see those old photos of people looking very serious and unsmiling, maybe they weren't just being stoic, maybe they were just trying not to breathe through their noses. And it wasn't just the streets. Let's talk about the hygiene inside the house. In 1880, we're right on the cusp of the modern world, but we aren't quite there yet. The germ theory of disease, the idea that invisible little bugs make you sick, was technically around. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were doing their thing in labs, but for the average person, and even for a lot of doctors, it was still a bit of a novelty. It was like reading about quantum physics today. You know it exists, but you don't really use it to make a sandwich. Most people still believed in miasma, which is a fancy word for bad air. They thought sickness came from smelly vapors, which, considering the horse situation we just discussed, was actually a pretty logical conclusion to jump to. But because they didn't understand bacteria, personal cleanliness was optional. If you were a wealthy elite living in a brownstone on Fifth Avenue, you might have a bathroom with running water. Maybe. But it probably wasn't what you're picturing. The water pressure was terrible, the pipes were often made of lead, which explains a lot about the erratic behavior of the upper classes, and the water itself wasn't exactly filtered. If you were middle class or poor, you were still dealing with chamber pots and a weekly bath in a tin tub in the kitchen. And by weekly, I mean if you were ambitious. There was a prevailing theory that bathing too much stripped the body of its vital oils and left you open to disease. So in a way, being covered in a layer of grime was seen as a protective shield, a natural force field against the miasma. People would wash their faces and hands to look presentable, but below the neckline, it was a no man's land. To mask the inevitable result of this protective shield, people relied heavily on perfumes and colognes, but these weren't the subtle, airy scents we have today. They were heavy, floral musk bombs designed to wage war against the ambient odors of the room. So imagine a crowded parlor in 1880. The heat is stifling because the windows are shut tight to keep out the night air. Everyone is wearing 5 layers of wool and velvet. Nobody has bathed since last Tuesday, and the air is thick with the smell of heavy lavender and horse dust. It's a wonder anyone ever fell in love. But let's say you managed to survive the smell and you wanted to look the part of a refined 1880s citizen. Let's talk about fashion, because this is where the gilded part really comes in. It looked great, but it was actively trying to kill you. For the ladies, 1880 was the era of the bustle. Now, fashion moves in cycles. In the 1860s, you had those massive hoop skirts that looked like you were smuggling a circus tent. By 1880, the silhouette had changed. The skirt became very narrow and tight at the front, almost like a pencil skirt, which made walking difficult. But all the fabric that was removed from the sides was essentially gathered up and piled onto the backside. The bustle was a structure made of wire, mesh, or sometimes just horsehair pads strapped to a woman's waist to give her a silhouette that looked like a centaur that had lost its back legs. It was huge. It projected straight out from the spine, sometimes a foot or more. It was so prominent that you couldn't really sit back in a chair. You had to perch on the edge or twist sideways. It was completely impractical, utterly uncomfortable, and therefore the height of fashion. But the discomfort was just the baseline. The real danger was in the colors. In the late 19th century, the chemical industry was booming, and they had figured out how to make vibrant synthetic dyes. One of the most popular colors was a brilliant, vivid green. It was everywhere. It was used in wallpaper, it was used in upholstery, and it was used in ball gowns. This color was often called Scheele's green or Paris green, and the secret ingredient that gave it that lovely emerald pop was arsenic. Yes, arsenic, the poison. People were literally walking around wrapped in poison. If a woman in a green dress sweated, which she certainly did because she was wearing 40 pounds of fabric and a corset in a room with no ventilation, the arsenic could absorb into her skin. There are reports from the time of women at balls feeling faint, developing rashes or getting headaches, and they'd blame it on the excitement or the tightness of their stays. But in reality, they were slowly being fumigated by their own fashion choices. And it wasn't just the dresses. They put this green arsenic in artificial flowers, which women wore in their hair. They put it in wallpaper in nurseries. There's a theory that Napoleon died of arsenic poisoning because of the green wallpaper in his room on St. Helena. And while that's debated, the fact that 1880s Americans were essentially lining their nests with toxic waste is not. But let's shift gears away from the accidental poisoning for a moment and look at the social structure, because this is where the real drama of 1880 lies. If you think high school cliques are bad, they have nothing on the New York high society of the Gilded Age. At the very top of this social pyramid sat one woman. Her name was Caroline Astor, usually referred to as the Mrs. Astor, not Mrs. William Astor, just Mrs. Astor, as if she were the only one in existence.
She was a woman of mediocre intelligence, no particular artistic talent, and she wasn't essentially known for her wit. But she had two things: a massive amount of old money, well, old for American standards, which meant her grandfather made it, and a will of iron. Carolyn Astor decided who was in and who was out of society, and she took this job very seriously. She had a ballroom in her house that could fit exactly 400 people, so her sidekick, a man named Ward McAllister, who was basically the ultimate frenemy and social climber, coined the term the 400. He said there were only about 400 people in New York society who were actually worth knowing. If you weren't on the list, you didn't exist. You were a ghost in a bustle. The criteria for getting on this list were vague but strict. You had to come from good stock, which meant your family had been rich for at least 2 generations. You had to have impeccable manners, you had to avoid scandal, and most importantly, you couldn't be new money. This brings us to the most delicious conflict of 1880, the old guard versus the new money. And nobody represented new money quite like the Vanderbilt family. The Vanderbilts were disgustingly rich. Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt had made a fortune in shipping and railroads. He was a rough, swearing, tobacco-chewing tycoon who didn't care about forks or ballroom dancing. But by 1880, he was gone, and his grandchildren were running the show. Specifically, Alva Vanderbilt. Alva was married to the Commodore's grandson, William K. Vanderbilt. She was feisty, she was ambitious, and she was furious that Mrs. Astor refused to acknowledge her existence. To Mrs. Astor, the Vanderbilts were vulgar. They were too rich, too flashy, and their money smelled like the railroad, industrial and dirty. Mrs. Astor would not invite Alva to her balls. She wouldn't even leave a calling card at her door, which was the 1880s equivalent
of blocking someone on Instagram. So Alva decided to go to war. But since this is the Gilded Age, she didn't use guns, she used architecture and a costume party. Alva convinced her husband to build a mansion on Fifth Avenue that would make Mrs. Astor's house look like a garden shed. It was a limestone palace modeled after a French chateau. It was massive, it was ostentatious, it was screaming, "Look at me!" And once it was finished, Alva announced she was throwing a housewarming ball to end all balls. She invited everyone, the entire list of the 400. Everyone was buzzing about it. It was going to be the event of the century. The young Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's daughter, was practically vibrating with excitement. She spent weeks practicing her quadrille dance with her friends. She had her costume ready. Then, just a few days before the party, Alva Vanderbilt dropped the hammer. She casually mentioned to one of Carrie's friends that unfortunately she couldn't invite Miss Astor. Why? Because the Mrs. Astor had never formally called on the Vanderbilt home. And of course, one simply cannot invite a stranger to one's home. It would be improper. It was a masterstroke of petty bureaucratic social violence. Alva used Mrs. Astor's own rules against her. When Carrie found out she couldn't go to the party of the year, she reportedly wept. She was devastated. And Mrs. Astor, faced with a crying daughter and the realization that she was about to be irrelevant because everyone else was going to the Vanderbilt party, had to cave. So, in a scene that I like to imagine involved a lot of teeth grinding, Mrs. Astor got into her carriage, rode up Fifth Avenue, and left her calling card at the Vanderbilt mansion. She surrendered. The next day, the invitation for the Astors arrived. Alva had won. The Vanderbilts were in, and the definition of society changed forever. It wasn't just about bloodlines anymore. It was about who had the biggest house and the most audacity. But while the Astors and Vanderbilts were fighting over calling cards and costumes, the average person in 1880 had very different concerns. Let's float away from Fifth Avenue for a moment and look at the domestic life of the middle class, specifically their obsession with health. If you walked into a drugstore in 1880, you were entering the Wild West of medicine. There was no FDA, there was no regulation.
You could bottle tap water, add some food coloring and a healthy dose of morphine, call it Dr. Good Vibes Miracle Tonic, and sell it to tired mothers for their teething babies. And people did. Patent medicines were everywhere, and the ingredients list reads like a suicide note today. One popular remedy for a cough was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It promised to quiet any restless child or adult, and it worked beautifully, mostly because it was loaded with alcohol and opium. Of course the baby stopped crying. The baby was comatose. If you had a toothache, you might buy cocaine toothache drops. They were sold right over the counter. The box usually had a happy picture of children playing, because nothing says wholesome family fun than applying a Class A narcotic to your gums. But it wasn't just drugs, it was the gadgets. The 1880s saw the rise of electric medicine. Electricity was the new magical thing, and people didn't understand it, so they assumed it could cure everything. You could buy electric belts to cure kidney disease, electric hairbrushes to cure baldness. There were even electric corsets that promised to zap the fat right off your body while also supporting your back. Of course, most of these things didn't actually have electricity in them. They just had some magnets or some stinging nettle woven into the fabric to give you a tingly sensation, so you thought it was working. It was the placebo effect, monetized on a grand scale.
One of the more disturbing health trends, though it's hard to verify how widespread it actually was, the rumors alone tell you about the mindset, was the tapeworm diet. The ideal of beauty was changing, but slimness was still in for the torso. So the story goes that you could buy a pill that contained a sanitized tapeworm cyst. You'd swallow it, the worm would hatch inside you, eat your food, and you would lose weight without having to give up cake. Then, once you reached your target weight, you'd take an anti-parasitic pill to kill the worm. Now, whether thousands of women actually did this is debated by historians, but the fact that it was advertised in the back of magazines says a lot about the lengths people were willing to go to. It makes our modern juice cleanses look pretty reasonable by comparison. And speaking of food, let's talk about what people were eating in 1880. If you weren't rich enough for a French chef, your diet was heavy. Refrigeration was still in its infancy, ice boxes were literal boxes with ice in them, so fresh produce was rare unless you lived on a farm or it was summer. The urban diet consisted of a lot of bread, potatoes, and meat that had been preserved in questionable ways. Canned food was becoming popular, but the soldering lead used to seal the cans sometimes leached into the food, so you could have your peaches with a side of heavy metal poisoning. Milk was a particular gamble. In the cities, swill milk was a major scandal. This was milk produced by cows that were kept in filthy stables attached to whiskey distilleries. The cows were fed the hot, fermented mash left over from making whiskey. The cows were sick, their teeth were rotting out, and the milk they produced was thin, bluish, and sometimes full of pus. To fix this, the milk sellers would add chalk, plaster, or molasses to make it look creamy and white again. They'd mix it up and sell it to families. It wasn't until the turn of the century that pasteurization and regulation really cleaned up the milk supply. So in 1880, drinking a glass of milk was genuinely an act of bravery. It really puts the good old days into perspective, doesn't it? We look at the beautiful architecture of the Gilded Age, the libraries, the train stations, the opera houses, and we think, wow, what a civilized time. But then you zoom in and realize the walls are colored with arsenic, the milk is full of chalk, the baby is high on opium, and everyone smells like a horse. And yet, despite all the grime and the poison, there was an intense pressure to be proper, to follow the rules. And the rules of etiquette in 1880 were a minefield designed to make everyone anxious all the time. We'll continue our deep dive into the bizarre social anxieties of the 1880s in just a moment. But first, let's take a second to just breathe. Thankfully, we aren't breathing 19th century coal smog. Just relax. We're going to float over to the concept of the fan and how a simple accessory could ruin your reputation if you held it the wrong way. Welcome back. We left off standing in the middle of a crowded, lavender-scented parlor, trying to navigate the absolute minefield that was 1880s social etiquette. And honestly, if you think modern dating is confusing because someone left you on read, you would not have survived the Gilded Age. In 1880, communication between the sexes was so heavily regulated that people had to invent entirely new languages just to say, "I like your mustache," or "Please go away, you smell like a stable." This brings us to the language of the fan. Every young lady of good breeding carried a fan. It wasn't just for moving air around, though given the corsets and the arsenic dresses we talked about, that was necessary. The fan was a signaling device. It was like a semaphore system for flirting. There were books written on this. If a woman carried the fan in her right hand in front of her face, it meant, "Follow me." If she drew it across her cheek, it meant, "I love you." If she twirled it in her left hand, it meant, "We are being watched." And if she dropped it, that meant, "We will be friends," which is the 19th century equivalent of, "I love you like a brother." Now, imagine the pressure. You're a young man, nervous, sweating in your wool suit, trying to remember if she just twirled the fan or shut it. Did she just profess her undying love, or did she tell you to get lost? If you misinterpret the signal and go in for a handshake or, heaven forbid, a conversation, you could be socially ruined. And you were never alone. Privacy was considered highly suspicious. Courtship in 1880 didn't happen at a restaurant or a movie theater. It happened in the family parlor, under the unblinking gaze of a chaperone. The chaperone was usually an older female relative, a spinster aunt or a grandmother whose sole job was to sit in the corner, knit something beige, and ensure that no touching occurred. The couple would sit on opposite ends of a sofa, or better yet, on two different chairs, and discuss safe topics: the weather, the sermon at church, the quality of the roads. If a young man wanted to see a young woman, he couldn't just show up. He had to initiate the ritual of the calling card. We touched on this with Mrs. Astor, but for romance, it was even more complex. A gentleman would arrive at the house and hand his card to the servant. The servant would take it to the young lady or her mother. They would inspect it. If they wanted to see him, he was invited in for exactly 15 minutes. If they didn't, the servant would return and say the ladies were not at home. Now, the man knew they were home. He could probably hear them breathing on the other side of the door, but "not at home" was code for "we are rejecting you." He had to take his card back and leave, presumably to go stare at a wall and rethink his life choices. If the card was accepted and the courtship progressed, the ultimate goal was marriage. But let's be honest, marriage in the upper classes wasn't really about love. It was a merger and acquisition. It was about consolidating real estate and bank accounts. And sometimes, to keep the money in the family tree didn't branch out quite as it should have. By 1880, the taboo against marrying cousins was growing, but it wasn't gone. In Europe, the royals were still happily marrying their first cousins and wondering why their children had hemophilia and chins that could open soda cans. In America, the first families of Virginia and New York were a little more careful, but second cousins? That was fair game. It keeps the inheritance simple, after all. But let's say the marriage happens. The wedding is a grand affair, lots of lace, lots of orange blossoms. Then comes the honeymoon. And for many Victorian brides, this was the first time they learned anything. Sex education didn't exist. Biology was something that happened to animals, not people. Mothers would often give their daughters vague advice like, "submit to your husband," or the famous advice, though perhaps apocryphal, given to a British bride, "lie back and think of England." So you have two people, likely strangers to each other's true personalities, stuck in a room with zero knowledge of mechanics, trying to start a dynasty. It's a miracle the population continued to grow at all. However, nothing in 1880 was celebrated quite as enthusiastically as death.
And then there was the hair. Hair jewelry. This was the peak of sentimental weirdness. When someone died, you would cut off a lock of their hair. But you didn't just keep it in an envelope. You sent it to a specialist who would weave that hair into intricate patterns. They made wreaths out of human hair to hang on the wall. They made earrings, brooches, and watch chains woven from the hair of the deceased. So, picture a nice 1880s dinner party. You're talking to a lovely woman in a mauve half-mourning dress. You compliment her bracelet. She smiles and says, "Thank you. It's my grandmother." Not, "It's from my grandmother." It is her grandmother. She is wearing her grandmother's follicle remnants on her wrist. And you would just nod and say, "How tasteful." This obsession with death wasn't just about grief, though. It was also about fear, specifically the fear of being buried alive. This was a genuine widespread phobia in the 19th century, known as taphophobia. And to be fair, they had a point. Medical science was shaky. The line between dead and in a coma was a little blurry for the average country doctor who was maybe drunk and using a mirror to check for breath. There were enough sensationalized stories in the newspapers about scratches found on the inside of coffin lids to make everyone paranoid. So, the market responded with safety coffins. These were patented inventions designed to save you if you woke up 6 feet under. Some had a glass window so the gravedigger could look in and check on you, which seems like a terrifying job. Others had a pipe running up to the surface so you could breathe. The most popular design involved a string tied to the corpse's finger. The string ran up through a tube to a bell mounted on the grave marker above ground. The idea was, if you woke up, you'd twitch your finger, the bell would ring, and the night watchman would come dig you up. This is where we get the phrase, "saved by the bell." Well, actually, that's a myth. The phrase comes from boxing, but people love to say it comes from coffins, so let's just enjoy the story. The reality is, the string would usually rot, or the corpse would shift as it decomposed and ring the bell accidentally, scaring the living daylights out of the cemetery guard. But it gave people peace of mind. While the adults were busy worrying about being buried alive or weaving hair bracelets, they also had to find ways to entertain themselves when no one was dying. The Gilded Age leisure activities were eclectic. One of the biggest crazes was pteridomania, or fern fever. For some reason, the Victorians and 1880s Americans lost their minds over ferns. It was like the Pokemon Go of the 19th century. People, mostly women, would tramp through the woods in their heavy dresses, hunting for rare fern species. They would dig them up, press them in books, or plant them in glass terrariums called Wardian cases. Fern motifs were on everything: wallpaper, teapots, chamber pots, biscuits. If it didn't have a fern on it, was it even art? It was a wholesome, outdoorsy obsession that allowed women a rare excuse to leave the house unaccompanied and get a little dirty. But if ferns were too boring, you could turn to taxidermy. And not just normal taxidermy, anthropomorphic taxidermy. This was the art of stuffing small animals, frogs, squirrels, kittens, and posing them like humans doing human things. You might have a diorama of stuffed squirrels playing poker, or frogs playing croquet. The most famous practitioner was a British man named Walter Potter, but the trend crossed the ocean. It was considered whimsical and cute. Imagine visiting your aunt, and on the mantelpiece, there's a stiff, glass-eyed kitten wearing a tiny dress and holding a tiny parasol. It's whimsical, it's creative, and it's deeply, deeply disturbing. And finally, if you were really bored and wealthy, you turned to spiritualism. The Gilded Age was the golden age of the ghost story. But they didn't just tell stories, they tried to contact the ghosts. The Civil War had left a lot of grieving families, and that grief fueled a massive industry of mediums and psychics. Seances were the dinner party entertainment of choice. You'd invite a medium over, turn down the gas lamps, hold hands around a table, and wait for a sign. The medium, usually a charismatic woman, would go into a trance. The table would rattle, strange knocking sounds would come from the walls, maybe some ectoplasm, which looked suspiciously like cheesecloth or egg whites, would ooze from her mouth. It was theater. It was a magic show performed in the dark for people desperate to believe. The Fox sisters, who started the whole movement years earlier by cracking their toe joints to make spirit-rapping noises, eventually confessed it was a hoax. But people didn't care. They wanted to believe. They wanted to know that Aunt Gertrude was okay on the other side and that she approved of the hair bracelet. So, you have a society that is buttoned up, repressed, terrified of germs but bathing in arsenic, obsessed with ferns, and spending their Friday nights holding hands in the dark, waiting for a ghost to knock on the table. It was a time of extreme contrast. But all of this, the parties, the hobbies, the clean clothes, relied on one thing, or rather one group of people, the invisible engine that kept the Gilded Age running, the servants. In 1880, if you had any money at all, you had servants. You didn't clean your own house, you didn't cook your own food, you didn't even dress yourself. But the relationship between the family upstairs and the staff downstairs was changing. The servant problem was the favorite topic of conversation for every wealthy woman. Good help is so hard to find, they would sigh, while paying a maid $2 a week to scrub coal dust out of the carpets for 14 hours a day. Let's drift down the back stairs, through the green baize door, and into the kitchen, because while the upstairs was drinking champagne, the downstairs was drinking lukewarm tea and trying to figure out how to polish silver without dying of exhaustion. We'll head down to the scullery in just a moment, but first, let's just pause and appreciate the silence of your own room. No bells ringing from a grave, no squirrels playing cards on your shelf, just quiet.
Welcome back. We've left the parlor, where the family is busy communicating with ghosts and hiding behind their fans, and we're heading downstairs. In 1880, the American dream was often built on the back of someone else's nightmare. If you were middle class or higher, you had help, but the reality of that help was a far cry from the polished, organized world of Downton Abbey. There was no charming camaraderie or benevolent lord of the manor giving you sage advice. There was just coal dust, endless stairs, and a bell that never stopped ringing. For the ultra-wealthy, the Astors and the Vanderbilts, the staff was a small army. You had a butler, who was basically the CEO of the dining room. You had a housekeeper who held the keys to the linen closet like they were nuclear codes. You had footmen whose main job was to look tall and open doors. And then you had the lower ranks, the chambermaids, the kitchen maids, and at the very bottom, the scullery maid. The scullery maid was usually a teenager, sometimes younger. Her job was to wash the dishes, all the dishes, and scour the pots and scrub the floor. She lived her life in the scullery, a small, damp room off the kitchen that usually lacked sunlight. She was the first one up, usually around 5 a.m., to light the kitchen range, a massive cast-iron beast that had to be hand-fed coal until it was hot enough to roast a side of beef. She would spend her day covered in grease and soot, invisible to the family upstairs. If Mrs. Astor walked into the kitchen, the scullery maid was expected to literally turn her face to the wall so the lady of the house wouldn't have to acknowledge her existence. It was a dehumanizing existence, paid in pennies and leftover food. But most Americans weren't Astors. They were middle-class families living in a brownstone or a nice wooden house in the suburbs. They couldn't afford an army. They could afford exactly one servant. This was the maid of all work. The maid of all work had the hardest job in 1880. She was the cook, the cleaner, the nanny, the laundress, and the doorman all rolled into one. She was usually an Irish or German immigrant, alone in a strange country, living in a small attic room that froze in the winter and baked in the summer. Her day began in the dark. She had to haul buckets of coal up 3 or 4 flights of stairs to light the fires in the family's bedrooms before they woke up, so their delicate toes wouldn't touch a cold floor.
Then she ran down to cook breakfast. Then she cleaned the chamber pots, which, remember, is exactly what it sounds like. Then she did the laundry, which involved boiling water, scrubbing boards, and a hand-cranked wringer that could easily crush your fingers if you weren't careful. And all day long, the mistress of the house would be watching her. Because of the servant problem, the idea that servants were lazy or thieving, the lady of the house felt the need to supervise everything. So the maid had no privacy, no autonomy, and no rest. Her time off might be one afternoon every 2 weeks, and maybe Sunday morning to go to church. That was it. It's no wonder that the turnover rate was incredibly high. Girls would work until they collapsed, or until they found a husband, any husband, just to escape the tyranny of the all-work life. But while the domestic sphere was running on old-fashioned muscle and coal, the world outside was beginning to buzz with strange new energies. 1880 was the dawn of the modern technological age, and frankly, people were terrified. Let's talk about the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell had patented it in 1876, so by 1880 it was starting to appear in wealthy homes and businesses. But it wasn't the sleek device we know today. It was a big wooden wall-mounted box with a crank on the side and a separate earpiece on a cord. Using it was an ordeal. There were no phone numbers yet. You picked up the receiver, cranked the handle to alert the operator, and then shouted at her. And I do mean shouted. People didn't trust that their voice could travel through a wire, so they compensated by screaming into the mouthpiece. If you were one of the lucky few to have a phone, it was usually installed in the front hallway. This meant that every conversation was a public performance. If you were calling your stockbroker or your mistress, the entire house, including the servants, could hear you yelling, "I said, sell the railroad stock." And the etiquette was a mess. Nobody knew how to answer it. Bell wanted people to answer with "ahoy, ahoy," which makes everyone sound like a confused pirate. But eventually, Thomas Edison suggested hello, and that stuck. But imagine a world where you could have answered the phone with "ahoy, ahoy." We really missed out on a cultural gem there. Then there was electricity. In 1880, Thomas Edison was just putting the finishing touches on his light bulb. Gaslight was the standard. Gaslight was warm, it flickered, it hissed, and occasionally it exploded and blew the roof off, but people were used to it. Electric light was different. It was steady. It was bright. Too bright. People complained that it was harsh and unflattering to the complexion. Ladies who had mastered the art of makeup for gaslight suddenly looked ghastly under the unforgiving glare of the electric bulb. There was also a genuine fear of the death wire. People thought that if you touched the switch, you might be electrocuted, or that the electricity would leak out of the socket and fill the room with invisible fire. Some wealthy families who installed electricity actually hired servants specifically to turn the lights on and off, because the family members were too scared to touch the buttons themselves. It was the ultimate luxury, outsourcing your fear of death. But if you wanted to see the true marvel of the age, you had to leave the house and go to the train station. The railroad was the internet of the 19th century. It connected everything. It was how goods moved, how news moved, and how people moved. Travel in 1880 was a tale of two extremes. If you were rich, you traveled in a Pullman palace car. George Pullman was a genius of marketing. He realized that Americans wanted to feel like royalty, so he built train cars that looked like rolling Victorian parlors. They had plush red velvet seats, intricate wood carvings, thick carpets, and chandeliers. At night, the seats folded down into sleeping berths. It was cozy, intimate, and very expensive. The service was impeccable, provided by Pullman porters, African-American men who were exclusively hired for the role and were all demeaning, referred to as George by the passengers, regardless of their actual names. In the dining room, you could get a 5-course meal served on fine china while hurtling through the countryside at 40 miles per hour. It was civilized, it was elegant, it was the only way to travel. Unless, of course, you weren't rich. Then you were in the emigrant car or the general coach. These were wooden boxes with wooden benches, no upholstery, no carpet, just wood, dust, and smoke. If you were traveling across the country, you sat on that hard bench for days. You brought your own food, usually a basket of bread and cheese that got progressively staler. The windows didn't really seal, so the soot from the locomotive engine would fly back and coat everyone in the cheap seats. You would arrive at your destination looking like a chimney sweep. And let's not forget the danger. 1880s trains were not exactly safety certified. The brakes were often manual. The couplers, the things that connected the cars, were a nightmare called link and pin. A brakeman had to stand between two moving train cars and drop a metal pin into a loop at the exact right second. If he missed or if he slipped, he lost fingers, or a hand, or his life. It was said you could tell a veteran railroad man by how many fingers he was missing. Accidents were common. Bridges collapsed, boilers exploded, and because the cars were made of wood and lit by kerosene lamps, if a train derailed, it almost immediately caught fire. And there was also a horrific phenomenon known as telescoping. If a train stopped suddenly or hit something, the momentum would cause the cars behind to smash into the cars in front. Because they were wooden, one car would literally slide inside the other like a collapsing telescope, crushing everyone inside. So, every time you boarded a train in 1880, you were essentially rolling the dice. You could have a lovely meal on velvet cushions, or you could be telescoped in a fiery wreck. It added a certain thrill to visiting Grandma. But let's assume you survived the train ride. You might be heading west, because in 1880, the West was still wild, but it was rapidly becoming a tourist trap. The Transcontinental Railroad had been finished in 1869, and now wealthy Easterners were taking vacations to see the frontier. They would ride the train out to see the cowboys and the buffalo, but by 1880, the buffalo were almost gone, slaughtered for their hides or just for sport from the windows of passing trains. The Wild West was already becoming a nostalgic performance.
You could stay at a grand hotel in Denver or San Francisco that rivaled anything in New York. You could eat oysters that had been shipped on ice from the East Coast. You could sip French wine while looking out at a mountain range that just a few years earlier had been considered impassable wilderness. But for the people actually living in the West, the homesteaders, the ranchers, the miners, life was incredibly harsh. A sod house on the prairie was a far cry from a brownstone. It was made of dirt. It leaked mud when it rained. Snakes would occasionally fall out of the ceiling onto your dinner table. The wind never stopped blowing. The isolation was maddening. There was a condition known as prairie madness. The endless flat horizon, the constant wind, and the utter lack of human contact would drive people, especially the women left alone in those sod houses, to a breaking point. They would talk to animals. They would scream into the wind. It was a stark contrast to the crowded, suffocating parlors of the East. In New York, you went crazy from the social pressure. In Nebraska, you went crazy from the silence. And speaking of silence, let's float back to the cities and talk about the night. The 1880s night was darker than anything we know. Streetlights were spread out and dim. If there was no moon, the spaces between the gas lamps were pools of ink. Crime was a real concern, but not in the way we think of it. There were pickpockets, sure, but there were also ghouls, body snatchers. Medical schools needed cadavers for anatomy class, and the legal supply was short, so a dark trade flourished. Fresh graves were dug up, bodies were stolen and sold to the back doors of hospitals. This fear fed right back into that obsession with death and safety coffins we talked about earlier. Not only were you afraid of waking up in a coffin, you were afraid that someone else would dig you up before you had the chance to wake up. It was a world of shadows, both literal and metaphorical. But let's move away from the graveyard shift and look at something a bit more colorful. Let's talk about the world of entertainment for the masses. If you weren't rich enough for the opera, and you weren't grim enough for a seance, where did you go for fun? You went to the Dime Museum. We'll buy our ticket to the Dime Museum in just a moment, but first, let's take a second to be grateful that our light bulbs don't hiss at us, and that our dishes are washed by a machine, not a weeping teenager. Just let that modern comfort sink in.
Hey guys, welcome back for our final drift through the year 1880. We've smelled the horse manure, dodged the arsenic wallpaper, survived the safety coffins, and watched a cowboy take his annual bath. Now, as our journey winds down, I want to take you to the end of the year, to the holidays. Because if you think the Gilded Age was extra on a normal Tuesday, you should see it at Christmas. But first, we have to understand that in 1880, Christmas as we know it was still kind of under construction. For a long time in America, especially in New England, Christmas had been illegal. The Puritans hated it. They thought it was too rowdy and too Catholic. But by the 1880s, thanks largely to German immigrants and Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband again, the holiday was booming. The centerpiece was, of course, the Christmas tree. But this wasn't the pre-lit artificial spruce you pull out of a box today. This was a real tree, cut from the woods. And how did they light it? With fire. They clipped small metal holders onto the drying pine branches and stuck little wax candles in them. Then, on Christmas Eve, and only on Christmas Eve, they would light the candles with a match. Just think about the physics of this. You have a dry, dead tree full of resin sitting inside a house heated by coal, surrounded by people in flammable hoop skirts, and you cover the tree with open flames. It was beautiful. It was magical. It was an absolute fire hazard. Families would gather around the tree for maybe 20 minutes to admire the glow. Buckets of water and sand were kept nearby, just in case the holiday spirit got a little too hot. Then they would blow the candles out. The risk was too high to leave them burning. It was a fleeting moment of beauty, edged with danger, the perfect metaphor for the era. The gifts under the tree were simpler, but usually unwrapped. They hung on the branches or were placed on a table. A child might get a wooden toy, a doll with a china head, an orange, a huge luxury, or maybe some of that chicken feed candy we talked about. But the real social marathon happened a week later, on New Year's Day. Today, New Year's Day is for sleeping in, watching parades, and regretting the champagne from the night before. In 1880, it was the most stressful social event of the year for men. It was the day of New Year's calling. This was a tradition where every gentleman was expected to visit every lady he knew. The ladies would stay home dressed in their finest reception gowns, with their houses decorated and tables laden with food and punch. The men would put on their morning coats and top hats and run a gauntlet. A popular man might have a list of 50 or 100 houses to visit. He would jump in his carriage or sleigh if it snowed, race to a house, run inside, bow to the hostess, say Happy New Year, maybe eat a pickled oyster or a macaron, drink a glass of punch, stay for maximum 5 minutes, and then run out to the next house. It was speed dating meets an eating contest. The problem was the punch. Every house served it, and it was usually alcoholic. Fish house punch, eggnog, mulled wine. If a man visited 40 houses and had a sip at even half of them, by 3 p.m., the streets of New York and Boston were filled with very well-dressed, very drunk men stumbling from brownstone to brownstone. By the evening, the calls became less formal and more chaotic. Hats were lost, carriages crashed, the wrong names were used. It was a societal endurance test. The women, meanwhile, kept score. They would compare notes the next day. We had 120 callers, Mrs. Smith would brag. Oh, really? We had 145, and Mr. Vanderbilt stayed for 7 minutes, Mrs. Jones would counter. It was exhausted glory. Eventually, this tradition died out because the cities got too big. You simply couldn't physically visit everyone anymore. But in 1880, it was the grand finale of the social season. And so, as the gas lamps flickered on New Year's night, the people of 1880 would go to bed. The scullery maid in the attic, exhausted from washing hundreds of punch glasses. The society matron, exhausted from smiling for 10 hours straight. The businessman, exhausted from dodging horse manure and creditors. They would climb into their high beds, sink into feather mattresses that swallowed them whole, and pull up heavy wool blankets. They would sleep in rooms that were freezing cold because the fires had died down. It was a hard life. It was a smelly, dangerous, judgmental, and toxic life, but it was their life. When we look back at them, posing stiffly in their black and white photos, it's easy to think of them as aliens, people who ate tapeworms and wore arsenic and feared fresh air. But they were just people. They wanted to be loved, they wanted to be warm, they wanted their neighbors to think they were cool. They were just working with really, really bad information. The Gilded Age eventually gave way to the Progressive Era. The plumbing got better, the medicine got slightly safer, the bustles disappeared, the horses were replaced by cars, which brought their own problems. But for tonight, let's leave them there, frozen in 1880. Let's leave Mrs. Astor in her ballroom, deciding who matters. Let's leave the cowboy in his bath, scrubbing off the trail. Let's leave the family gathered around their terrifyingly beautiful burning tree. The noise of the factories is fading, the shouting of the stock floor is gone, the rattle of the carriage wheels on the cobblestones is quieting down to a soft, rhythmic clatter. It's quiet now. The smog has lifted just enough to see the stars, the same stars we see, just a little clearer back then. You don't have to worry about calling cards, you don't have to worry about cholera, you don't have to worry about the fan language. You just have to relax. The history books are closed, the museum is shut for the night, the ghosts have stopped knocking on the table. It's just you, drifting in the safe, clean, comfortable present. Sleep well, guys, and I'll catch you in the next century.